In this video, we're going to talk about how to study for the MPT. So first things first, remember that if you are taking the Uniform Bar Exam, the MPT is worth 20% of your total score. That's a lot. So it's very important that you're taking the MPT seriously and that you learn how to study for the MPT so that you can approach it in the most efficient and effective way possible. So our first tip for you about how to study for the MPT is first get a general overview for what the MPT is. It's really hard to excel at something and know how to study for it and of course practice it well if you really don't know what it's all about in the first place. So the MPT consists of two 90-minute real-world legal tasks, and they're going to pass out both of these tasks to you at the same time, and it's your job to allocate about 90 minutes to each task. So keep that in mind. The great thing about the MPT is that you don't have to know any sort of specific law while walking into this portion of the exam. Instead, the MPT is testing these real-life tasks in your lawyering skills. And what they do in each MPT, they're going to provide you what we call a file and a library. So let's break down what each of those are quickly. The file will contain what we call a task memo and factual documents. Turning first to the task memo, this might be the most important document in all of your MPT documents. And this is because the task memo tells you exactly what you're supposed to be doing. It's going to outline any specific instructions about what you should or shouldn't talk about, any sort of formatting instructions. It tells you who your audience is. It's incredibly important. The other documents that you'll find in your file are the factual documents. So these could be things like interview notes, deposition transcripts, pleadings, discovery documents. Some might be super relevant and others might not be that relevant at all. It's your job to figure out how to use those documents. Now the second portion of each MPT is your library. And the library is what contains your law. And this is the law that you're supposed to use. Remember, you're not supposed to walk into this exam knowing any sort of outside law. They provide it for you. They could provide it in the form of case law, statutes, rules, regulations, or some sort of mixture of all of those things. It just depends. Remember, never assume any area of law because they could have changed the law for the purposes of that MPT. So they're seeing if you can use the law provided to answer the question and the tasks provided. So our second tip on how to study for the MPT is that you should get an overview of the general MPT formats. So we kind of started here our discussion with the MPT about what it is. And I said it's these two 90-minute tasks that test your general lawyering abilities. They're real-life lawyering tasks, in other words. And a huge part of your points for each of these MPTs is showing the grader that you know what these MPT tasks look like. In other words, you know how to format them. When a grader comes across an MPT that's properly formatted, it's very impressive and your score is going to reflect that. So we highly recommend that you get familiar with the highly tested MPTs. Those are things like objective memos, persuasive briefs, and letters, both demand letter and opinion letters. So if you know how to format those highly tested tasks, you're in good shape here. Our third tip for how to study for the MPT is to come up with a strategy for tackling the MPT portion. Here's the strategy or the approach that we recommend. So we first recommend that you read the task memo. Remember, I called that the most important document, and that's because it is. It tells you what you're supposed to be doing. So we recommend you start there. The next step we recommend is that you read the library. That is all of that law that they're providing to you. And then finally, your third step is that you read the facts in your file as you begin working and outlining on your response. Ideally, you should be reading and working simultaneously. Now, this is just our suggested approach. We find that it helps most people save time because time management on these types of tasks can be very challenging. So if you find that a different approach works better for you, great, go for it. But the key is that you're practicing, and that's how you're going to find out what approach will work best for you. And that leads me to our fourth tip for how to study for the MPT, and that's practice. Honestly, a lot of people put off the MPT. They think it's going to be very easy, and unfortunately, their score reflects the fact that they just simply haven't practiced. Remember, the whole purpose of the MPT is to test your skills, not necessarily the law, because they're providing you with the law. And you can only get better and sharpen your skills if you practice your skills. So if you are not practicing, you're not putting yourself in the best position possible to score high on this component of your uniform bar exam. So I have to urge you, even if you're a good writer, remember the MPT is not testing your ability to write. The MPT is testing your ability to analyze and respond to a task in 90 minutes. And that is something that can only be dealt with confidently with practice. And then our fifth and final tip for how to study for the MPT is honestly just a handful of a few tips and tricks that you can have up your sleeve in practice. And of course, they'll get better with your practice. So a few things to try to keep in mind in practice, and therefore it will translate to a higher MPT score, is make sure that every time you practice your MPTs, you are self-grading. This means that you are looking at your work product and you're comparing it to the National Conference of Bar Examiners point sheets. It's also helpful if you look at a good student answer or a sample answer. That will show you what a real student did under timed constraints in response to that task. Remember to commonly refer to that task memo as many times as you need to while you're crafting your MPT. A huge component of your score for the MPT is following directions. So if you're not doing that, it's really hard to get a high score. Pay attention to footnotes. Sometimes they drop footnotes in a case, and this is kind of like a test to see how detail-oriented you are. If you are referring to or citing to footnotes, it's going to show that you're detail-oriented. And then finally, pay attention to jurisdictions. So if they give you a whole bunch of cases, pay attention to where your cases are coming from. Depending on the jurisdiction that they tell you you're in for your MPT, some of the cases provided could be binding and some might just be persuasive. And being able to point that out for the grader is a big deal that will be reflected in your grade. So we hope that those 5 tips on how to study for the MPT are helpful.